Have you ever noticed how sometimes reality seems to bend toward what you're thinking, as if the world is quietly listening? Science used to call that coincidence. But something new has just emerged from neuroscience labs. Proof that a single focused thought can alter a physical outcome. This isn't mysticism dressed as science. It's measurable, repeatable, and deeply unsettling. In this video, you'll see how the old idea of a fixed, objective world is beginning to collapse, and how that discovery may reveal a hidden power inside your own mind, one that's been shaping reality all along. It starts with the first crack in what we once called the real. For most of modern history, reality has been treated like a wall, solid, external, and indifferent to what you think about it. Science, as we learned it, stood as the guardian of that certainty, a realm of equations and measurements where the observer was merely a bystander. But something began to shift when neuroscientists started to look more closely at attention itself. They weren't seeking mysticism. They were measuring focus, timing, and the subtle electrical rhythms that dance through the cortex. Yet in the middle of the graphs, a deviation appeared. One small, persistent irregularity that shouldn't have been there. Every time mental focus deepened beyond a certain threshold, the physical readings on the sensors changed. Slightly but measurably, electrodes recorded fluctuations that couldn't be explained by random noise or muscle artifacts. The instruments were calibrated again, the experiment repeated, and the anomaly returned, almost as if thought itself was leaning into matter, altering what the equipment captured. At first, the researchers assumed it was a flaw in the design, perhaps static interference, perhaps the environment itself. But when they isolated variables, the pattern remained tied to the mind's intensity. The brain wasn't just processing information, it was radiating influence. And the effect, subtle yet undeniable, broke a century-old belief that consciousness is passive. This was the first fracture in the old architecture of reality, the one built on separation. For decades, physics hinted that the observer mattered, but biology hesitated to admit it. Now neuroscience, through the study of attention, was beginning to whisper the same message. Observation isn't neutral. It participates. Think of it like tuning a string. When the mind's frequency locks into focus, the world around it seems to hum in response. The instruments capture the echo. The external isn't resisting, it's resonating. For the first time, scientists could no longer dismiss the idea that the act of noticing, of truly concentrating, might reshape the measurable field in which it occurs. One of the lead researchers described it quietly, almost reluctantly. It's as if attention is an active field, not a spotlight. That small shift in language, from spotlight to field, marks the difference between watching and weaving. A spotlight illuminates what's already there. A field, however, interacts. It pushes and pulls, it entrains, it participates. You can test a small version of this yourself. Close your eyes and picture a place that calms you. As your breathing slows, notice what happens to the sense of out there. The distance begins to soften. The room feels less like a container and more like an extension of your state. Your body, the air, the faint hum of electricity, they all start to belong to a single continuum. That subtle merging is what the instruments, in their own language of data, began to detect. The implications are unsettling and liberating at once. If mental focus can tilt physical readings, then reality may not be the fixed scaffold we once believed. It might be dynamic, responsive, woven from both energy and awareness. And if that's true, the role of human thought changes entirely, from spectator to participant. This doesn't mean that thinking happy thoughts makes mountains move. It means that at the microscopic probabilistic level, the level where both neurons and quantum particles operate, coherence of mind and coherence of matter might be two sides of one process. When one stabilizes, so does the other. For the researchers, the discovery was more than data. It forced a philosophical question. Where does the boundary between perception and reality actually lie? The old answer, outside the skull, now seemed incomplete. Because if focus could modify readings, then the border between internal and external was blurred. The observer and the observed were no longer separate nodes. They were components of one continuous system. What cracks open next is not just a scientific framework, but a human one. It means that what you call reality might be less about what exists independently and more about what stabilizes through participation. When the mind attends with coherence, the world seems to organize itself accordingly. When attention scatters, the environment mirrors that dissonance. The dance between mind and matter is not metaphorical anymore, it's measurable. And so for the first time, a long-dismissed intuition that thought and world are entangled begins to find a foothold in empirical observation. The wall we believed to be unshakable reveals itself as a membrane, thin and permeable, vibrating with every pulse of awareness. From here, the question shifts from if the observer influences reality to how deeply that influence runs. Because if attention can already nudge the instruments, what happens when the entire system of brain, emotion, and environment falls into sync? For more than a century, we have described the brain as a kind of biological camera, a receiver of impressions, a recorder of what is out there. Light strikes the retina, signals pass through neurons, and the mind assembles the picture. Simple, mechanical, and comforting. In that model, reality is stable and external, and the self is merely watching it unfold. But the closer neuroscience peers into the living brain, the more that metaphor begins to fracture. When high-resolution neuroimaging began tracking not just brain activity, but its timing in relation to the environment, an unexpected rhythm emerged. The brain was not merely responding to sensory input, it was anticipating it, projecting wave patterns milliseconds before events occurred. The cortex, it turned out, operates like a prediction engine, broadcasting signals that attempt to synchronize with the next incoming pulse of the world. The camera was actually a transmitter all along. These findings dismantle the myth of the passive observer. Every perception is a negotiation between what the world offers and what the mind expects. The neural oscillations, those rhythmic electrical waves that pulse through the cortex, create a kind of internal metronome that constantly aligns itself with the frequencies around us: sound, light, motion, emotion. When alignment happens, experience feels seamless. When it breaks, we call it confusion, fatigue, or even dissonance. What this means, in essence, is that you are not just seeing reality, you are participating in its unfolding. Your brain is an active player in the orchestra of existence, tuning and retuning itself in real time to maintain coherence with everything it perceives. The act of observation is creative, not passive. It shapes what it perceives, moment by moment. One neuroscientist studying sensorimotor synchronization described it as a dance between expectation and evidence. The mind predicts, the world responds, the brain adjusts. The gap between those loops is what you experience as time. The moment you become aware of something, your brain has already rehearsed it. And in that rehearsal lies the power to alter what becomes real. Imagine standing before a mirror that reflects not only your body, but also your state of mind. Every thought, every focus of attention subtly shifts the image you see. That's not a metaphor anymore. It's an emerging physiological truth. The waves of your brain do not stop at the skull. They extend into the electromagnetic fields surrounding your body. Those fields interact with the environment, influencing the same space where external signals arrive. Perception becomes an interference pattern, a dialogue between internal vibration and external input. That is why coherent states of mind, deep focus, meditative calm, creative absorption, often correspond with greater clarity and synchronicity in outer experience. In those moments, the brain's projections and the world's signals resonate. There's less noise, less contradiction. You move through space as if guided by an invisible rhythm that was always there, waiting for you to match it. You can feel this synchronization in simple ways. When you walk beside someone and your steps gradually fall into the same cadence. When you focus deeply on a task and time seems to dissolve. When an intuition, barely a whisper, leads you to act a second before logic could explain why. These are not accidents. They are glimpses of a deeper coherence, the living proof that observation is a force, not a reflection. Of course, the rational mind resists this idea. It wants to believe that perception is objective, that the world exists independently of our gaze. But the data says otherwise. Neural predictions shape sensory input so powerfully that even when presented with contradictory evidence, the brain often bends perception to fit expectation. Reality becomes a canvas painted by probability, not certainty. And here lies a subtle paradox. The clearer your attention, the more flexible the world becomes. Because clarity reduces noise, and with less noise, the brain's synchronizing field exerts a more precise influence on what unfolds. This isn't magic, it's biology in motion. Neural networks fire in coherence, hormones align, perception sharpens, and action follows with uncanny precision. The system becomes one continuous feedback loop between thought and event. If you've ever experienced that fleeting sense of flow, where movement, intuition, and environment merge, you've tasted what it means to dissolve the illusion of being separate from what you observe. The you who sees and the world being seen collapse into a single field of resonance. That field is where the so-called external world and internal experience meet, exchange information, and shape each other. And so the myth of the passive observer crumbles. The evidence now points toward a participatory universe, where consciousness doesn't merely register the moment, it sculpts it. Attention is no longer just a lens, it is a frequency generator, sending and receiving simultaneously. Once this is understood, a new question arises naturally, almost inevitably. If your brain is constantly projecting signals that help weave reality, what happens when those signals carry patterns of fear, loss, or limitation? What forms of life begin to echo back when the inner field is distorted? There is a quiet contradiction at the heart of human change. People want transformation, new careers, new relationships, new health, new peace, yet they rarely change the pattern of thinking that built the old reality in the first place. They chase new outcomes while rehearsing the same mental chemistry that created the current one. And because the brain does not distinguish between what is imagined and what is lived, it continues to sculpt the same internal world, expecting a different external result. Neuroscience has made this painfully clear. Each thought generates a cascade of electrical and chemical signals that tell the body what reality to prepare for. Think fear, and the amygdala floods the system with stress hormones. Think loss, and the body braces for absence, tightening, conserving, withdrawing. Think failure, and dopamine levels drop before you even begin the task. These are not metaphors, they are measurable physiological events. The mind sets the body's state, and the body becomes the emotional proof of what the mind believes. This is the invisible loop most people never notice. They wake up each morning and replay yesterday's emotional soundtrack, unaware that those repeated thoughts are scripting the next day's behavior, choices, and perceptions. The external world appears stable, not because it is unchangeable, but because the internal signal never varies. The brain keeps projecting the same internal movie, and the environment keeps offering the same matching scene. You can witness this mechanism in the simplest moments. Imagine a person convinced they are always overlooked. Even in a room full of welcoming faces, their attention will unconsciously search for the one indifferent glance, the small confirmation that sustains their belief. Their chemistry reacts, a spike of cortisol, a subtle contraction in the chest, and their body sends that signal back to the brain. See? It's happening again. A complete loop of expectation fulfilled by perception, locked inside its own evidence. The tragedy of this mechanism is not that it exists, but that it goes unnoticed. Because once it is seen, it can be interrupted. But the interruption requires something rare: awareness without judgment. The moment you catch a repetitive thought, the same self-criticism, the same silent prediction of loss, you are already standing at the edge of its pattern. In that instant, the observer awakens inside the observed. The process of transformation begins not with willpower, but with neuroplasticity. When a new thought is rehearsed, not merely imagined once but sustained with emotion, new synaptic connections start to form. The brain reorganizes its internal wiring, weakening the circuits of old beliefs and strengthening those of the new. Over time, the emotional signature of the body adjusts as well. The chemistry of fear gives way to the chemistry of possibility. But this shift cannot happen while the mind oscillates between focus and distraction. Coherence requires consistency, and consistency requires awareness. One of the most revealing studies on cognitive restructuring showed that when individuals practiced holding a single constructive image for even 60 seconds without interruption, measurable changes in heart rate variability and neural coherence appeared. The brain and body began to synchronize, forming a temporary state of harmony that researchers could observe in real time. But when attention wavered, when the subject's mind drifted, the coherence collapsed and the old neural rhythm reasserted itself. It's as if the mind's creation circuit short-circuits each time distraction enters. Most people, without realizing it, are training distraction as their dominant state. The constant switching between screens, thoughts, and emotions fragments the very coherence required for change. They crave a new life while thinking in static, sending mixed signals to the brain that say simultaneously, "I want expansion, and I don't believe it's possible." The result is stasis, not because reality resists, but because the internal command is contradictory. You can sense the same principle in your own body. Recall a moment when you felt deeply aligned, a decision that felt true, an idea that carried energy. The body opened, breathing deepened, vision widened. Now compare it to a moment of doubt or fear. The contraction is immediate. Muscles tense, breathing shallows, attention narrows. Both are self-generated states, and whichever one you repeat more often becomes the template through which reality organizes itself around you. This is the mistake almost everyone makes without noticing. They try to build a new external structure while living inside the chemistry of the old self. They plan change intellectually while their body still vibrates with the frequency of the past. The system cannot evolve under those conditions, not because of fate, but because biology requires coherence. The shift begins with something deceptively simple: to notice what your thoughts feel like, not what they say. Each thought leaves a trace in the body, a warmth, a tension, a subtle acceleration. When you recognize those sensations, you begin to see how the invisible architecture of belief keeps recreating the same ground beneath your feet. And in that recognition lies the first opportunity to alter the signal, to send a new instruction to the field that surrounds you. Because beneath all the data and metaphor, one truth is becoming impossible to deny. Your internal narrative is not describing your life, it is programming it. And once that realization stabilizes, another question quietly emerges. If thought shapes biology so directly, what happens inside the brain when imagination itself becomes the central organizing force? Inside every human brain lies a network designed not just to recall the past but to construct the future. It's called the default mode network, a web of regions that activates when you're not focused on the outside world. Neuroscientists once dismissed it as idle noise, the mind wandering without purpose. But recent research has revealed that this so-called resting state is anything but passive. It's the engine of imagination, the circuit that transforms invisible thoughts into the architecture of possibility. When you imagine, the brain begins to simulate reality before it happens. The visual cortex lights up as if you're actually seeing. The motor regions engage as if you're already moving. The emotional centers flood the body with the same chemistry that would accompany the real event. In other words, imagination is rehearsal, a full-bodied preview that teaches your system what to expect. And because neurons that fire together wire together, each rehearsal strengthens the neural pathways that make the imagined scenario more likely to occur. This process bypasses logic entirely. The brain doesn't wait for evidence before it begins to adapt. It organizes itself according to emotional images, vivid, sensory, coherent scenes that carry feeling. A single clear image can do what 1,000 abstract affirmations never could. It gives the nervous system a map. The stronger and more coherent the image, the more the brain's internal networks synchronize, aligning perception, decision-making, and even the micro-timing of movement to follow that internal blueprint. You can observe this in athletes who visualize performance before competition. Their heart rate, muscle activation, and timing shift as if they were physically performing. The brain can't tell the difference between the external event and the internal one. It prepares the same pathways, primes the same chemistry, and reinforces the same expectations. The body becomes a participant in imagination, not just its vehicle. Now extend this principle beyond sports, into relationships, creativity, healing, or personal purpose. Each time you construct a mental image of a future experience, your brain begins to build a predictive model of that reality. It reallocates attention, filters sensory input, and nudges behavior in small invisible ways that bring external circumstances into coherence with that internal model. You start noticing details you once ignored. You interpret coincidences as signals. What you call intuition is the brain aligning with its own prediction. This invisible circuit works like a compass, orienting you toward whatever picture you feed it. But the signal must be coherent. When imagination is scattered, half-formed, interrupted, or emotionally inconsistent, the neural coherence collapses. Competing patterns cancel each other out, and the brain receives no clear instruction. That's why daydreaming without emotion rarely changes anything. It's the combination of imagery and feeling, the sensory imprint fused with emotion, that turns fantasy into a biological directive. One study on neuroplasticity in trauma recovery demonstrated this mechanism vividly. Participants who repeatedly imagined safe, empowering scenarios activated the same brain regions involved in real experiences of safety. Over time, those neural circuits grew stronger, and their physiological stress responses diminished even without external change. The imagined experience recoded their baseline reality. The mind had sent new orders to the body, and the body responded as if the world had obeyed. The circuit runs deeper than conscious thought. At its core, imagination modulates the thalamus, the brain's sensory gateway, determining what information enters awareness and what stays filtered out. When you imagine with clarity, the thalamus prioritizes sensory data that matches your internal model. You literally begin to see more of what you believe. This is not wishful thinking, it's perceptual selection. The brain's survival depends on predicting what matters most, and imagination teaches it what that is. You can test the process yourself in a small way. Close your eyes and picture an event that hasn't yet happened, but that you deeply desire to experience. Don't just think about it, inhabit it. Feel the texture of the air, the sound in the distance, the weight of your body inside that scene. Notice the emotions that rise when you hold that picture steady. Within seconds, your body begins to synchronize. Breath slows, posture shifts, heart rhythm adjusts. The internal image has already become a signal. Over time, repetition stabilizes this internal environment. The brain begins to prefer the new pattern because it offers coherence. Coherence feels like truth to the nervous system. And once the pattern stabilizes, perception and decision-making follow it automatically. You start saying yes to what matches that imagined future and quietly detaching from what doesn't. Behavior shifts not by effort, but by resonance. This is the invisible circuit, the biological bridge between thought and world. It's how a single coherent image can rewire an entire life. But it's also fragile. Each distraction fractures the signal, scattering the very coherence that allows imagination to manifest. And that fragility reveals a deeper obstacle that most people never consider: the silent way in which divided attention sabotages creation itself. There is an unseen force that dissolves nearly every attempt at transformation. It doesn't roar, it doesn't threaten, it simply interrupts. Distraction is not just a modern inconvenience, it is the single most efficient mechanism by which the mind loses coherence. And without coherence, the invisible circuit that turns imagination into reality collapses. When neuroscientists map attention in real time, they find that each focus state creates a unique pattern of synchronization across the brain. Networks that normally operate separately begin to oscillate together, forming a temporary unity. It is within that unity that creative insight, emotional regulation, and neuroplastic change become possible. But the moment attention fractures, the pattern dissolves. The brain falls back into noise, a kind of electrical static that consumes energy but produces nothing. Distraction works like entropy. silent, relentless, and always waiting for the smallest crack in awareness. It takes many forms: the phone lighting up beside you, the loop of unfinished thoughts, the emotional residue of yesterday. But beneath all of them lies the same effect. It breaks the continuity of focus. And that continuity is the bloodstream of creation. Every time you shift attention, the brain must rebuild the neural alignment it just lost. Imagine trying to forge a piece of metal while repeatedly cooling it in water. Each interruption resets the process, and the form never stabilizes. This constant resetting explains why so many visions fade before they can take shape. The mind holds a picture of possibility, begins to align thought and emotion around it, and then a notification, a worry, a memory, the coherence shatters. The internal field that was building resonance disperses into fragments. The image weakens, the chemistry reverts, and the brain returns to its default predictive loops. Creation becomes a stuttered rhythm instead of a continuous melody. The tragedy is that most people never notice this erosion. They mistake distraction for normalcy, believing that divided attention is the price of modern life. But from a biological perspective, chronic distraction is a state of mild cognitive disintegration. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for sustained attention and goal direction, must constantly reorient itself, draining metabolic energy that could have been used for innovation or emotional stability. Over time, this depletion feels like fatigue, doubt, or loss of purpose, symptoms not of failure but of friction. Experiments on attentional control show that even brief interruptions, as short as 15 seconds, can double the time needed to return to deep focus. The brain's coherence takes longer to rebuild than to destroy. Each distraction leaves a trace, a residue of unclosed loops that hum beneath awareness, demanding energy to suppress. Eventually, the system grows so cluttered that imagination loses its channel. You can still think, but you can't create. The signal drowns in its own noise. There's also a deeper layer. When attention is scattered, emotional coherence collapses too. The heart, whose rhythms synchronize with the brain during focused states, begins to fluctuate erratically. This incoherence sends contradictory feedback to the nervous system, one signal of expansion, another of contraction, confusing the body about what to prepare for. It's like trying to play two melodies at once in different keys. The result is dissonance, and the body feels it as tension, restlessness, or subtle unease. This is why scattered thought doesn't just waste time, it fragments identity. You begin to feel less yourself because coherence is what gives the self its continuity. Without it, life becomes reactive, a sequence of half-formed impulses instead of a deliberate creation. And yet, the mind's vulnerability to distraction reveals something hopeful. Attention is not just fragile, it's responsive. It can be trained, strengthened, tempered like metal under heat. When you notice distraction, you're already in the act of regaining coherence. Awareness of the break is the first spark of repair. The key is not to fight the distraction, but to return to the image, to the breath, to the single vibration you were cultivating. Every return rebuilds the field stronger than before. In certain contemplative studies, practitioners who repeatedly recentered their attention, no matter how many times it wandered, developed more stable neural synchrony than those who maintained perfect focus from the start. The act of returning created resilience. The circuit of imagination doesn't demand uninterrupted attention, it demands loyalty to the return. Creation isn't destroyed by distraction, it's destroyed by forgetting to come back. Still, most people remain unaware that each fractured moment carries a cost to the mind's coherence. The invisible sabotage accumulates until the ability to hold a clear internal image feels impossible. That's why in the pursuit of transformation, discipline of attention becomes not moral but mechanical, the act of protecting the internal signal from noise. And when that signal is protected long enough, something extraordinary begins to happen. The mind and body, once fragmented by distraction, start to move in rhythm again, and that rhythm doesn't end within you. It reaches outward. Because when focus deepens beyond a certain threshold, The brain's oscillations can synchronize with the fields around it. And in that state of resonance, the boundaries between mind and environment begin to blur once more. There comes a moment when focus crosses a hidden threshold, when thought, emotion, and physiology lock into a single rhythm. The mind stops feeling like something inside the head and begins to feel like a field expanding outward. This isn't metaphor. It's resonance, a measurable synchronization between neural activity and the electromagnetic environment that surrounds the body. For decades, it was assumed that the brain's oscillations were self-contained, but recent experiments have begun to reveal a more intricate dance. The frequencies of thought can fall into step with the frequencies of the world. In laboratories studying neuroelectromagnetics, researchers trained participants in deep, sustained focus. Sensors recorded both brainwaves and external electromagnetic fluctuations in the room. What they discovered startled even the skeptics. At certain levels of mental coherence, especially during calm, high-focus states, the patterns of brain activity began to synchronize with external fields. The environment responded as though the mind's rhythm had reached out and touched it. Each time the synchronization occurred, the instruments registered subtle physical shifts, fluctuations in magnetic amplitude, micro-variations in electrical charge. Thought, it seemed, was no longer an internal event. It was a participant in the physical landscape. This state of resonance doesn't appear through effort or intensity. It arrives through alignment, the gentle coherence of attention, emotion, and bodily rhythm. When the heart, breathing, and brain waves begin to oscillate in harmony, a coherent field forms around the body, measurable by sensitive instruments. The same frequencies that sustain that internal order seem to extend outward, mingling with the environment's natural fields. The border between observer and observed blurs. You are no longer looking at the world from within a skull. You are vibrating within it. This is not mysticism disguised as science. It's physics and physiology meeting halfway. The human body is an electromagnetic system. Every heartbeat generates a measurable field that extends several feet beyond the skin. Every neuron emits oscillations that, when synchronized, amplify into collective waves. When these waves achieve coherence, they don't stop at the body's edge. They interfere with and are influenced by the surrounding electromagnetic fabric of the planet itself. Imagine two tuning forks across a room. Strike one, and the other begins to hum in sympathy. This is resonance, energy transferring through vibration without physical contact. The same principle governs the interaction between the brain's oscillations and the fields that fill space around it. When mental and emotional coherence reach a certain quality, the tuning forks of mind and world begin to sound together. The environment stops being background and becomes orchestra. You can sense this phenomenon in small, personal ways. When you walk into a space where someone has been anxious or angry, you feel it before a word is spoken. When a group enters deep focus or shared intention, time feels denser, silence alive, perception sharper. These aren't coincidences. They're the sensory consequences of resonance. The collective field organizes, information flows more freely, and subtle changes occur in the way matter behaves. One set of experiments involving synchronized meditation groups showed measurable alterations in local magnetic readings and even small fluctuations in temperature. The researchers avoided grand conclusions, but the data spoke quietly. Focused coherence generates physical effect, and more intriguingly, those effects could be reproduced. Each time the group entered deep synchronization, the instruments responded. Reality wasn't resisting, it was listening. When mind and field fall into resonance, perception itself changes texture. The boundaries between inner and outer soften. Sensory detail sharpens, yet everything feels unified. Action becomes effortless because intention and environment are now moving in the same direction. The person who experiences this alignment often describes it as a kind of transparency. Thought turns into movement without hesitation. Desire translates into event without friction. This is what athletes call flow, artists call inspiration, and contemplatives call union. Different languages for the same biological coherence. Neuroscience is only beginning to explore the implications of this state. It suggests that consciousness might not be limited to neural tissue, but could operate as a field phenomenon, one that interacts with and organizes energy beyond the brain's borders. If this proves true, then what we call focus may be a form of energetic coupling between human and environment, a feedback loop through which both evolve. The practical meaning of this is profound. It implies that reality is not fixed in front of you, but dynamically entangled with the quality of your awareness. Every coherent thought becomes a subtle vibration that influences the medium you live within. Every emotional state transmits information through that shared field, either stabilizing or distorting it, and when enough coherence accumulates, within one mind or many, measurable matter begins to reorganize in response. This is the point where science and experience begin to converge. The experiments only confirm what intuition has whispered for centuries. That thought is participatory, not private. The field that surrounds you is not separate from you. It is the continuation of your consciousness in another form. And as this understanding deepens, another realization emerges naturally, that the boundary between thinking and happening may never have existed at all. For generations, thought was treated as a private event, invisible, contained, ephemeral, something that lived and died behind the eyes. But if the mind and the field are capable of resonance, as new data suggests, then this division collapses. Thought is not the prelude to reality. It is one of its earliest manifestations. Every mental impulse, electric, chemical, vibrational, is already part of the same continuum that later appears as matter, movement, or circumstance. The distinction between thinking and happening is a convenience of language, not of physics. Neuroscience, physics, and biology are beginning to converge around this idea in ways few expected. When you have a thought, neurons discharge microcurrents that alter the electromagnetic field surrounding the brain. Those fluctuations ripple outward, interacting with the larger field of the body, which then modulates hormonal release, muscle tone, cardiac rhythm, and even the electromagnetic environment in the immediate space. In other words, every thought begins to happen the moment it arises. The world inside and the world outside are separated only by degree, not by kind. Consider the split-second chain of events that occurs when you imagine something vividly, say, stepping into cold water. Before your skin even meets the surface, your nervous system has already fired the pattern of experience. Muscles tense, breath shortens, and the body prepares for the chill that isn't physically there. The mind creates a signal, and the signal becomes an event within the organism. To your biology, it is indistinguishable from the external one. Thought has already happened. This same mechanism extends beyond the skin. In experiments measuring ultra-sensitive electromagnetic fields, researchers observed that brain-generated frequencies could be detected several feet away from the body, influencing nearby sensors and interacting with the ambient environment. The signal diminishes with distance, but it does not vanish. The wave continues. Every human mind, then, is a transmitter, and every space a receiver. We are constantly broadcasting small vibrations of coherence or chaos, and those vibrations participate in shaping the probability landscape of what unfolds next. To understand how this could be possible, consider how nature operates at every scale. A seed does not wait for approval to become a tree. Its form is already encoded in vibration, in structure, in potential. A single fluctuation in a quantum field gives rise to particles, and from those particles, entire worlds. The boundary between intention and manifestation is as thin as the pause between frequencies. The mind, being a pattern of oscillation, belongs to the same order of creation. Its thoughts are ripples in the same ocean that forms mountains, storms, and galaxies. When you think, truly think with attention and emotion united, you're not describing the world, you are informing it. The nervous system acts as a translation device, turning invisible patterns into physical impulses that influence everything from cellular metabolism to subtle environmental fields. This is not metaphorical power. It is participation in the physics of existence. Most people experience this connection unconsciously. They notice coincidences, gut feelings, or moments when imagination seems to precede reality, yet they dismiss them as chance. But the line between chance and resonance is drawn only by awareness. The more coherent the observer becomes, the more those coincidences appear as natural outcomes of interaction between inner and outer fields. What used to be called intuition may simply be perception extending beyond the body, the recognition of one continuous process. To see this, try a small experiment. Recall a time you felt absolute certainty about something before it happened, a phone call, a meeting, a decision. At that moment, your entire system, mind, body, field, was already tuned to the future event. You didn't predict it. You participated in its formation. The event and your awareness of it were two faces of the same vibration. That's why true intuition feels calm, not dramatic. It doesn't arrive as surprise, but as recognition. This collapse of boundary challenges nearly everything we've been taught about control, causality, and selfhood. If thinking and happening are the same continuum, then you are never merely reacting to reality. You are always co-creating it. Every thought, however brief, adds a small impulse to the collective field, which organizes itself according to the patterns most consistently reinforced. Repetition becomes resonance, and resonance becomes form. From this perspective, even the smallest inner gesture matters. A fleeting moment of compassion, a single act of focus, can alter trajectories beyond perception. Because the field is continuous, there is no true outside to your thought. The echo of your mind moves through the same fabric that carries light, gravity, and sound. Each pulse leaves an imprint, subtle but real, weaving into the probabilities that define tomorrow's events. Science is only beginning to describe this in the language of measurable data, but the implication is ancient. Mind and matter are expressions of one phenomenon. The creative process doesn't start when you act, it starts when you think, and it doesn't end where your body does. Which leads to a revelation both humbling and transformative. If thought is an active force in the fabric of the world, then perhaps the ancient language of manifestation was not poetry after all, but an intuitive translation of neurobiological and energetic coherence. And in that realization, the old separation between science and spirituality begins to dissolve, revealing a single field viewed from two sides. For centuries, science and spirituality seemed to live on opposite sides of a great divide, one anchored in data, the other in meaning. Science demanded proof, measurement, repeatability. Spirituality spoke in symbols, intuition, and inner knowing. Each dismissed the other's language as incomplete. But the closer we move toward understanding consciousness, the thinner that divide becomes. What once appeared as opposing worldviews are now converging around a single realization. The universe is participatory, and awareness is not an accessory to existence, but one of its fundamental expressions. Neuroscience began this convergence almost accidentally. When researchers examined the brain during deep meditation, prayer, or states of profound focus, they expected to see patterns of inactivity, the mind resting, disengaged from external stimuli. What they found instead was astonishing. Rather than going silent, the brain reorganized. Regions responsible for self-referential thinking quieted down, while networks associated with compassion, unity, and present-moment awareness synchronized in near-perfect coherence. The brain wasn't shutting off, it was tuning in. The same harmonics that physicists describe in matter, wave interference, resonance, and coherence, were occurring in consciousness itself. At that moment, a new language began to form. What ancient mystics once called oneness could now be observed as synchronized oscillations across billions of neurons. What traditions named spirit could be understood as coherent energy patterns influencing both physiology and perception. Science was not invalidating spirituality, it was translating it. Both were describing the same reality through different instruments, one through data, the other through direct experience. This intersection becomes even more striking when we consider the field theory of consciousness emerging from physics. The classical view, that the mind is a byproduct of the brain, is losing ground to models suggesting that consciousness might be a field in which the brain participates, much like a radio receives and modulates signal. In this framework, The brain is not the source of awareness, but a receiver and amplifier of it. The implications echo spiritual teachings that have endured for millennia. That consciousness is fundamental, not secondary. That matter arises within awareness, not the other way around. Imagine the shift this represents. For centuries, spirituality described the world as one interconnected field of energy, where intention shapes experience and inner alignment alters the external. Now quantum biology and neuroscience are beginning to observe those same principles. Attention-shaping neural connectivity, emotion-altering gene expression, and coherent brain-heart synchronization affecting measurable electromagnetic fields. What was once devotion is now data. This convergence doesn't diminish the mystery, it deepens it. Because as science maps the architecture of consciousness, it also encounters its own limits. Instruments can measure frequencies, coherence, and energy exchanges, but they cannot yet quantify meaning, awe, or sacredness, the interior dimension of experience. That's where spirituality continues to offer language, not to replace science, but to complete it. The two are like hemispheres of one brain, analytical and intuitive, seeking and knowing, each incomplete without the other. In practical terms, this meeting point changes how we understand intention and responsibility. If thought can influence matter even subtly, then the inner life of each person becomes a measurable force within the collective field. What spirituality has long framed as karma or energetic resonance, physics might describe as information exchange across interconnected systems. Every coherent act of focus, compassion, or creativity contributes to the stabilization of that shared field. The work of personal transformation becomes a contribution to planetary coherence. You can sense this intersection in the simplest acts of attention. When you hold a thought of gratitude long enough, your heart rhythm stabilizes, the vagus nerve signals safety to your body, and your electromagnetic field extends in smoother waves. That coherence, in turn, affects the nervous systems of those around you, not symbolically but physiologically. Science measures it, spirituality names it sacred. Both are describing the same event, consciousness reorganizing reality through resonance. Perhaps this is what ancient texts meant when they spoke of the Word made flesh. Language, thought, vibration, all expressions of consciousness crystallizing into form. Neuroscience now sees it as neuroplasticity guided by intention. Physics views it as energy condensing into matter through coherence. Spirituality experiences it as manifestation. Three vocabularies, one phenomenon. At this intersection, the idea of separation dissolves. Between disciplines, between observer and observed, between mind and world. The experimenter and the mystic are beginning to describe the same landscape from opposite directions, one mapping its mechanics, the other living its essence. And as their perspectives merge, a new kind of knowledge begins to emerge, one that does not divide fact from meaning, but unites them in the act of creation itself. Because if thought and world are intertwined, then understanding reality becomes not just an intellectual pursuit, but an ethical and emotional one. The quality of our awareness shapes the quality of the world we inhabit. And that realization leads naturally to the question that science alone cannot avoid any longer. If one focused mind can alter a field, what happens when billions of minds align in coherence, unity, and intention? Once you understand that thought is not confined to the skull, that every mental vibration ripples outward into the shared field of existence, a single question begins to take shape. It is not a philosophical curiosity, but an unavoidable confrontation. If a single focused mind can alter physical measurements, what happens when billions of minds broadcast fear, scarcity, and anxiety all at once? Modern life is drenched in signals. Every news feed, every argument, every moment of outrage releases a wave into the collective atmosphere of consciousness. These aren't metaphors. They are measurable electromagnetic emissions, small but constant, converging into a planetary field generated by human biology itself. The Global Coherence Initiative, a long-term research project, has been studying this for years, correlating fluctuations in Earth's magnetic environment with collective emotional states. Global celebrations, disasters, and crises. Their data shows what ancient traditions always intuited. Human emotion leaves fingerprints on the fabric of the planet. Now imagine that field in its current condition. Billions of brains generating chaotic waves, spikes of alarm, loops of worry, chronic vigilance. The world feels unstable not only because of events, but because our collective nervous system is resonating with turbulence. Thought doesn't just describe crisis, it sustains it. Our species in this sense is both the observer and the generator of the storm. You can feel this in your own body when you enter a crowd charged with tension. The muscles tighten before words are spoken, the heart rate quickens, and the mind's clarity fades. The field of emotion becomes contagious, overriding individual equilibrium. What most people don't realize is that the same phenomenon happens globally, silently. Each fearful thought contributes to the static. Each act of coherence contributes to order. The scale may differ, but the principle is the same. This question, what are we collectively thinking into being, dismantles the illusion of personal isolation. It reveals that private thought is never entirely private. The frequency of consciousness you maintain doesn't stop at your skin. It extends into the same network that every other mind inhabits. Every moment of coherence you generate is a micro-adjustment to that field, just as every wave of anger or despair is. Reality then becomes not just a mirror of individual focus, but a chorus of global resonance. What would happen if that chorus became intentional? If instead of billions of dissonant signals, human thought began to align, not through uniform belief, but through coherence itself. Science already knows what synchronized systems can do. When pendulums align, they conserve energy. When cells oscillate in rhythm, they heal faster. When heart and brain synchronize, perception expands. The same physics applies at the collective level. Coherence amplifies effect. A small group in sustained focus can generate order that radiates far beyond its size, because coherent waves reinforce one another, while chaotic waves cancel out. This isn't idealism, it's interference pattern physics. When thoughts are fragmented, their fields scatter. When they align, through shared attention, compassion, or intention, they combine into something measurable. Laboratory experiments with group meditation have already demonstrated drops in localized crime rates, shifts in random number generators, and subtle electromagnetic changes in the surrounding space. These effects, though modest, are consistent. The question is no longer whether consciousness can influence reality, but how deeply that influence can reach when it becomes collective. Yet this possibility brings responsibility. If the brain shapes real pathways based on internal imagery, then every habitual emotion becomes a contribution to the global pattern. Fear feeds instability. Greed magnifies scarcity. Resentment hardens division. The field doesn't judge, it simply mirrors, which means that every act of attention is a creative decision with consequences far beyond what you can see. To live with this awareness is to realize that consciousness is a kind of civic duty. The inner atmosphere of each person adds to the weather of the world. You can no longer say it's just a thought, because thoughts are forces, invisible yet formative. The future, then, is not waiting to happen. It is constantly being written in the shared resonance of our minds. There's a reason the most enduring spiritual teachings across cultures emphasized attention, compassion, and unity long before science could measure their effects. They were describing, in their own language, the same mechanism that physics is only now beginning to observe. Coherence generates order, division generates entropy. One leads to creation, the other to decay. And now, faced with the data and the evidence, the question refuses to disappear. If a single thought can alter a measurement, what will billions of coherent thoughts do? This is the question that stands at the doorway of a new epoch, one where responsibility is not moral but energetic, where evolution depends not only on technology but on the alignment of consciousness itself. Because if mind and matter are one continuum, then the fate of the planet is in part a reflection of our collective inner climate. And as that realization takes root, another begins to form quietly behind it, waiting for language. Perhaps what is emerging now is not mysticism at all, but a new stage in the evolution of scientific understanding, the recognition that thinking has always been a creative act. We've crossed the threshold where belief becomes observation, and observation becomes creation. Thought is no longer invisible. It's the first movement of reality itself. Every idea you hold is a vibration shaping the field you live in, sculpting the possible with each pulse of awareness. You are not waiting for the universe to respond. The universe is responding already, in perfect coherence with your state of mind. So if you've come this far, take a breath and type, "I am aware of my field" in the comments. It's the small act that marks your arrival, the proof that you stayed until the end and understood what this truly means. And if this exploration stirred something in you, if you want to see how deep this connection between mind, matter, and consciousness really goes, watch one of the videos now appearing on your screen. Each one is another doorway into the same truth. Reality is listening to you.